This story is neither an accusation nor a confession, and least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will simply try to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped its shells, were destroyed by the war. Those are the opening lines to All Quiet on the Western Front, quite possibly the most influential war movie ever made. They were originally written by Eric Remarque, the author of the book of the same name, which had come out a year before. Both made an immediate impact upon release because they told a side of the war that most people had no clue about. This was the generation of men who went out, saw, and did terrible things, and then came home and never really spoke about it. And even if they did, it was usually so buried in layers of fiction because that's the only way that men of the time could really express themselves. That's how you get men like Tolkien and Hemingway, who wrote these fantastical fictional worlds to try to find a way to express the traumas that they experienced during the war without blatantly coming out and saying it. And Eric Remarque would do the same thing with his famous book, All Quiet on the Western Front. He was a veteran of the First World War who had spent a month on the front line in 1917, who then came back home, compiled his experiences in his novel, and made his main character, Paul, a stand-in for himself, and all of the other Germans of his generation who witnessed the horrors of the First World War. While Remarque's book was popular upon release, it was the movie that was made about it the year later that really catapulted it into the public consciousness. Because the film, made by Louis Milestone, came out and shocked audiences in a number of ways. Because it was a film that broke a lot of unwritten rules in the industry and also blazed new trails in filmmaking and cinematography. It was a movie so good that even though its message was horrifying to many of the people that watched it, they couldn't deny the movie's effectiveness. And many people afterwards tried to make this movie mandatory viewing for school children, because it is in many ways the definitive anti-war film of all time. This film was so shocking to audiences because it actually showed the war how it was. The director himself was a veteran, as was a vast majority of the cast. They went out there and instead of just hiring regular extras off the streets, they set out to find veterans of the First World War who would move like soldiers and when the time came, would die like them on screen. This was the era of the bullet ricochet noise and people getting shot either dramatically grabbing their stomach or throwing their hands up wildly like they're getting very into singing the song YMCA. There's none of that in this movie. Men who are hit with bullets simply crumple, or get tangled in barbed wire, or blown up leaving only their hands attached to said barbed wire. It shows men being bayoneted and being stabbed in shell holes and slowly bleeding out in front of the men who stabbed them. This is a movie that unflinchingly depicts war as it was. And it also wasn't afraid to point the fingers at the men who started the war and the total disillusionment of the soldiers who fought it. There are several scenes of men just sitting around questioning why they're there. One of my favorite dialogue scenes of the movie is when the platoon is lounging around after eating a meal, and one of the men asks, "What does the Kaiser not have in this world that he is going to gain with all of our lives?" It's a poignant question, and one that was no doubt talked about endlessly in the dugouts and shell holes as a way for these soldiers to pass the time in the years of the war. Since this movie came out in 1930, it was in the Goldilocks zone, historically speaking. It was far enough away from the First World War that people had flushed out the wartime propaganda from their system, and they were willing to actually sit down and watch a movie about this war. And it was far enough away from the Second World War that the political rhetoric and propaganda demonizing the Germans once again had not been kicked into full swing. And the only place to actually ban the movie, ironically, was Germany. Because when the movie came out, there was a little thing called the Nazi Party just getting started, and this was one of their first group bonding activities, was to go into these theaters and throw stink bombs and attack people with clubs and try to shut down the box office so this movie couldn't be shown. And eventually, a few years later, when the Nazis took power, this was one of the first movies on the banned list because it was anti-German. Personally, I think that Goebbels was just being the bitchy queen that he was, and he was bitter that, once again, a Jew had made a better movie than he did. But that's just my personal opinion. I couldn't say one way or the other if that's actually true or not. And we come at last to my issue with the movie. Because originally I set out to make a video dunking on All Quiet on the Western Front. Because I'm tired of seeing movies that are trying to copy it. And then as I was writing this, I realized that, well, I guess my problem actually isn't with All Quiet on the Western Front. The originator of a trend is not really responsible if everybody else tries to copy it. And then I was like, well, maybe I can make an episode about all the different changes in the armies that fought World War I. Because the army did evolve. You know, the general stereotype of World War I, that was 4 years of pointless conflict that chewed up 10 million lives and really didn't do anything. It was a stalemate the entire time on the Western Front, and it was just two hands cranking meat grinders on opposing sides. And that view of the war is understandable, because many of the men who survived it and came back and wrote books about it, that was their ground-level experience. They were there in the mud, in the trenches every day, and to them, the war hadn't changed that much at all. The armies were more or less the same as they were in the beginning, and even the places where they were sitting, on the graves of their fallen comrades before, it would seem like nothing of note had changed. But the armies had changed in the intervening years. And the best example of this is in 1916 when Romania joins the war, and they march off to battle with a 1914-style army. They've got their guns and artillery and all, but they're inexperienced, and they're going to fight the war like all the other countries of 1914 did. And they run into a mixed conglomeration of German, Austrian, Ottoman, and Bulgarian troops who are fighting at 1916 standards, and they wipe the floor with them. Romania falls in a matter of months, and all they did was simply add to the war chest of the Central Powers, and likely prolong the war by at least another 6 months, because it was essentially like Germany had just broken the British blockade and was able to get foodstuffs and supplies that they desperately needed to continue the war. But as I was writing that episode, I was like, wow, this is going to take forever to get through all these different changes, and that would be an excellent topic for another video. So depending on how this one goes, that may be the next episode we do. Eventually, what I settled on doing is offering up my substitution for what I see as the sameness of most World War I movies. Because most World War I movies follow the same formula as All Quiet on the Western Front and its remakes. You've got two sides going at each other, there's a charge, a countercharge, some artillery, soldiers complaining about the futility of war, rinse and repeat, end of movie. There are a few that break that mold. You know, most recently the movie 1917 did that, showing the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line, and I applaud it for actually trying something different in the First World War movie genre. Instead of just sitting here and complaining about something in society, I am going to actually do the right thing and offer my substitution. Because if you're just going to sit around and complain about a problem without offering any kind of solution, that's just whining. So if there's any Hollywood executives out there listening, contact links are in the description below. Hit me up. I will instantly drop everything and become a historical advisor to make some version of this movie. Well, we can talk about directors and all that, but personally, I would like to see Gareth Edwards get a shot at this. And for the writers, I would like to bring out Tony Gilroy. I want to bring back the two creatives who made Rogue One, the best Star Wars movie of the Disney era. Gareth Edwards is great at shooting scale, and Tony Gilroy is great at writing tragic stories. I think we combine those two together again, we have got a winner. The two areas that I would like to base these movies in are at both the beginning and the end of the First World War, 1914 and 1918 respectively, because these were the two times that the German army almost won the war. And unlike the Second World War, you can actually root for the German army in these battles because they did nothing wrong. Well, except for the whole rape of Belgium, whatever happened there.
Your brother Billy, whatever happened there?
All right then. Whatever happened there?
The shooting.
Whatever happened there?
God rest his soul, man.
I'll tell you what fucking happened. This piece of shit's cousin put
down,
6
Phil.
bullets in the kid without any provocation whatsoever.
Both of these periods in the war are fascinating. Hindsight shows us that World War I was unwinnable on the battlefield. The technology had progressed to just enough of a point that you couldn't really fully have a breakthrough on the front lines, and it hadn't progressed enough where breakthroughs could be exploited. If you concentrate enough artillery and send enough men through a breach, you can break through any kind of defenses. But without radio communications, large-scale motor transport, and some kind of armored way to exploit retreating troops, there's simply no way to win the First World War. But in both 1914 and 18, the German army came pretty damn close, and that's exciting storytelling. So for our 1914 movie, I'm thinking the title should be Der Tag, at least in Germany, because they'll actually understand what that means. You probably have to come up with a different name for English-speaking audience, because people are like, oh yeah, I want to see that Der Tag movie, and it's not going to be very eye-catching. But I just like saying Der Tag, because German is oftentimes fun to say. And that was the name that most common soldiers gave for this operation. The history books call it the Schlieffen Plan, or the Schlieffen von Moltke Plan. It was a plan that was drawn up pre-war to knock the French out of the war before the Russian army could mobilize and invade East Prussia. This plan was the linchpin of the German war plans, and everything relied on it going smoothly. And it is one of the things that sabotaged the pre-war peace talks more than anything else from the German side. Because the Germans at the beginning of the war are on a clock. You have the French and the Russians in alliance with each other. You have the English who have sworn to defend the neutrality of Belgium and will enter the war if Belgium is invaded. Problem is, if the Germans don't invade Belgium, they have to run through the prepared defenses along the German-French border. The French are naturally wary of the Germans because 50 years before this, the Germans swept down into France in the Franco-Prussian War that ended up creating Germany in the first place, and they so decisively defeated the French in a Battle of Cannae-style envelopment where the French lost one of their main army units and a member of the royal family was captured on the field. This defeat was deeply traumatic to the French people, and so they spent the next 50 years building fortifications along the Germano-Franco border. The Germans probably could have assaulted their way through these in a couple places, but as we said before, the Germans don't have time. They're on a ticking clock. They have 6 weeks from the start of the war until they think the Russian army will be ready to march and invade East Prussia. So, in order to do this, the Germans decide to do a little outflanking maneuver of the French. Now, the only place that they can outflank the French is where the French don't have a border with Germany. That is because the tiny country of Belgium sits between the two. And the French aren't worried about the Belgians invading because they're a tiny country, and France has the second largest military in continental Europe. And the French don't think that the Germans are going to be that crazy enough to bring another great power into the war to outflank them. Turns out, though, that's exactly what the Germans planned to do, and they had more than 1 million men lined up on the Belgian border ready to invade and outflank the French defenses. If you want to find out more about this story, Barbara Tuchman has a great book, The Guns of August, that really goes into depth to all the pre-war wrangling and all these armies as they're scrambling to try to find a way to get their men in the field and keep them alive long enough to save their country from completely collapsing. It's a fascinating story. The stakes are at their absolute highest because these are countries literally fighting for their national survival. and you get to see the armies of the great power fighting in a peer-to-peer conflict for the first time in generations, learning the hard way with the blood of tens of thousands of men, the lessons that would force them into the trenches and the stalemate of the Western Front. But in the early days, there wasn't this great trench system. It was open maneuver warfare. These armies were finding out what happens when you send a battalion of cavalry in a full shoulder-to-shoulder charge in front of in-place machine guns. They're finding out what shrapnel and high-explosive artillery does when it hits a company of soldiers in an open field. They're finding out just how detrimental it is to not have portable radio communications where officers can directly communicate with command to let them know the situation, to correct artillery barrages to stop them from dropping on their own men. And it shows just how far you can push a man marching on his feet, fighting in 30 days of continuous combat before his body just breaks down completely. These were all lessons that had to be learned the hard way and in blood by all the combatants of the First World War. And a story where a nation is throwing tens of thousands of its youth away a day is tragic, and it hits a chord that would resonate with audiences greatly. The Battle of the Frontiers, or the Race to the Sea, as it's known by some historians, is a fascinating way to look at World War I because it completely defies the expectation that most audiences have when they go into a World War I movie. They're expecting trenches and barbed wire and the blasted hellscape of no man's land, and to be able to flip that on its head and show them militaries learning the hard way, I think is effective storytelling. The grand finale can be the Miracle on the Marne, where after weeks of retreating and fighting running battles with the Germans, both sides are exhausted. They're at their final gasp of energy. Everybody has had to walk and fight for all this time. And finally, when the French and English armies turn around at the Marne, this is the final punch that both boxers can throw in the fight, and the French somehow win. Against all odds. And the legend of the Miracle on the Marne is born. There's your grand finale, and there's your movie. So my second idea is kind of the opposite of the first. Where we have our Der Tag movie. Maybe this can be a sequel. Maybe if the first movie does well, we can make a sequel to this, or we could just have a little montage in the beginning, for 4 years, World War I has raged on. There have been countless battles that really didn't, do anything militarily, but now the German army has prepared its final offensive of the war. And we come to the German 1918 Spring Offensive, or the Kaiserschlacht. God, that's such a fun word to say. I love it. It's one of my favorite parts about the German language, because a lot of times you have these super long words that are just them combining a bunch of other existing words to basically describe what the word does, and it's also one of the most badass things you ever heard. For instance, you could have something like a Flüberwerk canoe, which is just a flak gun. The Kaiserschlacht is such a fascinating story because it is Germany's last chance to win the war. Because at this point, the Americans have been in the war for several months. They've been bringing their men over. They're still being trained by the French. And the French and the English are fighting back and forth about who gets the new Americans. The American soldiers don't bring any real light machine guns with them. There's no artillery. It's just riflemen and heavy machine guns. They're inexperienced. The American army hasn't really fought a major war in decades. The last time they ever fought anyone close to a peer rival with them was the Spanish-American War in 1898. They had suppressed the last of the Native American fighting, pretty much, and had briefly invaded Mexico. But the American army was incredibly inexperienced and would need a lot of work done on the training fields of England and France. But it was estimated by 1919 the Americans would commit a force of 2.5 million men to the war effort. And even if they weren't being used in offensives, they could simply hold the old French positions and allow the French and English to go on the offensive. And so Erich Ludendorff, the quartermaster general in title, but really the guy who was running most of Germany with Hindenburg, realizes that they can no longer sit on the defensive, because that had been the German war plan for most of the First World War. They realized after the Verdun offensive that offensives really weren't getting them very far. The German army had a whole bunch of plates in the air because they had to fight on the Western Front against the two other great powers of the world, England and France, but they also had to deal with the war on the Russian front. And they also had to regularly bail out their Austrian allies as they made a mess on the Eastern Front and on the Italian front as well. The Germans had terrible allies, and 9 times out of 10, without the German army's intervention in these different fronts, they would have folded completely, and Austria probably would have been out of the war by about 1916, at the rate they were going. So Germany has spent the entire war with its forces divided. But now, thanks to the October Revolution, the Russians are out of the war, and 1 million German veterans are shipped to the Western Front. For once, the Germans actually have numerical superiority on the Western Front. They've got more men. They've got more guns. They've spent the past winter training their troops in stormtrooper tactics, which most modern soldiers would realize is just common sense fire and move tactics, but for armies at the time, that was kind of groundbreaking. It's like, well, maybe we shouldn't just run through belts of machine gun fire in a line. Maybe we should actually, creep up close during the artillery barrage and then make a final quick little rush throwing every explosive that we can strap to ourselves into the enemy trench positions before we try to jump into them. These were novel tactics, and the Germans were the best at them, with the Canadians being probably a close second. But Ludendorff has crafted a series of offensives to hit critical points in the French and English line to try to cause one or both of these armies to collapse and retreat from their prepared defenses. To do this, he has brought along from the Eastern Front the greatest German artillery officer of the war, Georg Bruckmüller, otherwise known as Breakthrough Mueller, who had refined the art of artillery down to a precise science. Before that, every time you moved a battery into position, you would have to fire ranging shells, and then when the final bombardment would open up, it would be thousands of guns all shooting shells in the same direction for days upon days, absolutely saturating the area that was being attacked and giving the enemy plenty of warning. The front line troops may have been pretty much obliterated in their dugouts, but the reserve lines could be stacked up because they knew exactly where the offensive was, because why else would a country spend 10 days shelling one piece of ground if they weren't planning on attacking it? Where Bruckmüller would differ is, instead of taking all of these guns and shooting for days, he would concentrate all of his fire in one sector for a matter of a couple hours, shift his fire, shift back again, and then attack. So first he would pound the front line trenches to try to break up the barbed wire and the obstacles and the front lines. Then he would target the close-range field artillery and trench mortars. He'd throw gas shells on them so they had to get gas masks on and they couldn't effectively do counter-battery fire. He would blow them to smithereens, focus on the front line trenches one more time, and then shift back to the second and third line trenches to assist a breakthrough after the first line had been overcome. Now, while all this is going on, storm troops are moving up within about 100 yards of the front line. They're hiding in shell holes, and right before the breakthrough happens, the artillerymen drop smoke shells right in front of the stormtroopers, allowing them to approach invisibly until they're basically right on top of the enemy trenches in grenade throwing range. And while he's doing this, he's concentrating massive amounts of artillery in one place. Because your average artillery bombardment of the war was called drumfire, in which guns were firing so quickly it sounded like a drum roll. It's like this. Every second is taken up with the sound of a gun going off. But in a hurricane barrage, there's so many guns firing in one spot, it's literally just one big noise. It is completely incomprehensible, and you can hear and basically feel nothing except for the vibrations of the shells going off. These barrages were so intense that in some places, even on the German side, men couldn't light their cigarettes because the shock waves coming off the front line from all these high explosive shells hitting the trenches was traveling across no man's land and blowing out their matches in their own trenches. That's how intense these barrages were. And it worked. the Germans were doing historic breakthroughs in the different offensives of the Kaiserschlacht. You have Operation Michael, Georgette, Gneisenau, and several other smaller offensives. All were making historic gains. The German army is punching through these lines for dozens of kilometers. Battles that cost 1 million men before and gained a kilometer of ground. Now you're looking at gains of 25, 30, 40, even 50 kilometers in some places. And we see the return once again of open warfare. The German army in certain places has broken through the trench line and is now plowing undisturbed fields as it is with their artillery shells. You're seeing fights in places where all the trees and ground haven't been blasted to oblivion. The ground doesn't look like Mordor, at least in the very beginning of the battle anyway. And you're seeing massive amounts of casualties as a result once again, because there's no more dugouts and trenches to defend these men in the open as shells rain down all around them. And it's also fascinating because these breakthroughs cause incredible panic on the Entente side. The British and French governments almost collapsed several times due to the shock of these offensives, and you could either do this as a bit of comic relief in an otherwise pretty bleak and dreary movie, or you could do a little spin-off and we could do a third-style movie just talking about the panic caused by the German breakthroughs during the Kaiserschlacht. And if you want to get a good sense of this, another good book to read if you're picking up World War I books would be John Toland's 1918, because he really dives into all the interpersonal conflicts the generals had. It has the bickering and political sniping between Haig and Foch, Pétain, Lloyd George, Clemenceau. If we are going to do a separate movie about this, I want to get the director and writers of The Death of Stalin. I would love to see a Death of Stalin style movie about the political wrangling of the generals and politicians in World War I.
Which doctor have you called?
Oh, well,
The subject's currently under discussion.
yes, as acting general secretary, I think that, the committee should decide.
The committee? But our actual general secretary is lying in a puddle of indignity. I mean, I think he's saying, get me a doctor now.
No, I don't agree. I think we should wait until we're quarantined.
Quarant? The room is only 75% conscious.
Are you wearing pajamas?
Yes, so?
Why?
Because I act, Lavrenti, decisively and with great speed.
I said you'd be tested, and right now you're being tested by a shouting man wearing pajamas. Have you got a nappy under those too? Too late for him.
The dark comedy setting is perfect for this because these men are bickering about who's to blame for what and who doesn't like who more and who gets to have priority in the offensive, while tens of thousands of their countrymen are dying on the front lines, and the military situation is quickly collapsing while they're just bickering amongst themselves. But we finally come to the climax of our film, and we have the German army finding out the same problems they had found in 1914. There's a limit to what you can ask a man to do. No matter how well you plan for these offensive, men can only do so much, especially the men of 1918 who have been at reduced rations for the better part of 2.5 years now. And half the times these offensives are breaking down because as soon as the Germans break into the front line of trenches, they just raid the French and English pantries, which are like banquets compared to what the Germans had been subsisting on for the last couple years thanks to the restrictions imposed by the blockade. And these offensives begin to peter out. Despite the victory, morale is still low, and once again the Germans are finding out that they have no real way to exploit these breakthroughs once they have been achieved. Because once the prepared artillery positions are taken out, and they have to move forward, then they're off their map square, the guns aren't registered once again, and without radio communications they can't be effectively called in. Because before these battles, there's just days and days of aerial reconnaissance and photographs. They blow these pictures up. The artillerymen know exactly where the bends in the trenches are and possible gun emplacements are. But once they're in the open country and the enemy is retreating, they have no idea. And without your average platoon commander having a radio to be able to call in for artillery support, there's simply no way to effectively target these guns. And one of the best examples of this is in Ernst Junger's biography. and he's talking about his role in Operation Michael, where they have advanced like 30 kilometers, and now they're at the edge of the range of German artillery. And because the German artillerymen have no targets, they've just extended their barrels up as far as they go and are shooting at maximum range. What they don't know is, at their maximum range, the only people they're hitting with their shells are German soldiers. And Ernst Junger was one of the men hit with some of that shrapnel. That was one of the 9 times he was wounded in 17 different places. The guy goes through all that, goes through 3 years of war, comes home and writes a biography that's basically the anti-All Quiet on the Western Front, where he's like, yeah, the war was pretty fun. I enjoyed it, despite being wounded in 17 different places during the course of the war. So those are my 2 ideas. Like I said, anyone in Hollywood is out there that needs a historical technical advisor, hit me up. I will be there. I have plenty more ideas about World War I movies or just historical movies that we could make in general. I've got ideas, okay? We can make a whole movie about how much of a douchebag Woodrow Wilson is. I'm sure our friend Cynical Historian would love to be a consultant on that as well. And if not, he'll probably be the first one to pre-order tickets for it. So you've got at least one sale right there. We can do alternative history. What if Teddy Roosevelt won the election instead of Wilson? How different was that for the world? Can we really blame the Rockefellers for making us join the Allied side instead of the Central Powers? It's kind of suspicious, like 20% of the country was made out of Germans, and yet somehow we're fighting against the Germans because J.P. Morgan and the Rockefellers lent a bunch of money to the English and took all the wealth of the old world. Was World War I really karma for the colonial period? There's so many different ideas that we can do. Somebody call me and put me behind a camera, and we can make it. My name has been Neil Eckert. This is War and Conquest, and the podcast is once again going all quiet on the Western Front.